The gosling ran desperately to the neighboring farm, honking non-stop. Michael shouted in irritation, "Go away, you crazy bird!" But the animal wouldn't give up, tugging insistently at his shirt. When he finally followed the goose, what he found changed his view of animals forever. Before we begin today's story, let me know where you're watching from. Go ahead and grab a coffee or get comfortable on the couch, and please don't forget to support us. All you have to do is click the like button, and I'll know you enjoy this type of story. So ready? Let's get started. The morning sun painted the fields stretching beyond the small rural property in shades of gold. Helen opened the kitchen door carrying a bowl of cracked corn, just as she had every morning for over 40 years. Her steps were slower now, but her determination remained the same as when she was young, sharing these chores with her husband. "Good morning, my loves," she murmured sweetly as she approached the chicken coop. The hens ran towards her, clucking and scratching excitedly around her feet, but the first to arrive, as always, was Popcorn. The young goose flapped his wings and stretched his neck, making a soft sound she had learned to interpret as pure affection. 6 months ago, when she found the abandoned egg in the yard, Helen never imagined that this little creature would become her most faithful companion. "Easy, Popcorn. There's enough for everyone," she laughed, scattering the grains on the ground. The goose remained by her side, unlike the other animals that dispersed to eat. It was always like this. Popcorn seemed to understand that she needed company, especially in the moments of silence that weighed too heavily on the empty house. On the other side of the wire fence, the neighbor's farm was already stirring. Michael was lacing up his boots on the porch, preparing for another day of tending to the cattle. At 25, he had taken over responsibility for the property after the old groundskeeper retired. It was demanding work, but he liked the country life, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. As he walked towards the corral, Michael waved to the lady next door. She was always in her yard at this time, caring for those animals as if they were her children. He found it amusing how she talked to them, especially that goose that seemed to be her favorite. "Helen is quite a character," he thought, returning the discreet wave she gave him. Although they weren't close friends, a respectful cordiality existed between them. Michael knew she lived alone since her husband passed away, and he sometimes wondered if she needed help, but the woman seemed so independent that he never dared to ask. Back in her yard, Helen felt a slight dizziness, but attributed it to getting out of bed too quickly. She paid it no mind. At 73, minor discomforts were part of the routine. She continued spreading the feed, watching with affection how each animal had its own unique personality. The ducks gathered near the small water trough, always in perfect sync. The chickens squabbled over the best grains with little arguments that made her smile. And Popcorn. Well, Popcorn was still there, like a silent guardian, watching her every move with those attentive eyes. "You're an angel, you know that?" she whispered, gently stroking the goose's head. "I don't know what I'd do without you all." It was true. After she was widowed, the animals became her emotional anchor. Every morning had a purpose because they depended on her. Every evening was less lonely because they welcomed her with genuine joy. And Popcorn, especially, seemed to have a sixth sense for her most difficult moments. Michael, now in the corral, was checking the cattle feed when he heard the familiar sounds from the neighboring property. The noise of the birds was always part of the region's morning soundtrack. It was comforting in a way. It meant everything was in order, that life was following its natural, predictable rhythm. What he didn't know was that in a few moments, this peaceful routine would be dramatically interrupted, and that the goose he saw playing in the yard next door every day was about to become the hero of a story that would completely change his perspective on the intelligence and loyalty of animals. For now, everything seemed normal. The sun continued to rise, casting shorter shadows. The animals ate peacefully, and two parallel lives went on their way, unaware that they would soon be connected by an act of courage no one would expect from a simple gosling. Helen put the empty bowl away and decided to take advantage of the mild weather to check the fence at the back of the property. It was a task her husband always did, but now it was up to her to keep everything in order. Popcorn followed her, as he always did when she walked around the property. "Come on, my companion," she said, smiling at the goose keeping pace beside her. "Let's see if that loose section still needs fixing." The walk to the back of the property took 5 minutes, through a small apple orchard she and her husband had planted decades ago. The trees were heavy with fruit, and she made a mental note to pick them later this week. As she walked, Helen didn't notice that her breathing was slightly more labored than usual. The dizziness she had felt earlier returned, but she ignored it again, focusing on the task at hand. On the other side of the property, Michael was carrying buckets of feed for the cattle. It was physical work, but he liked the feeling of doing something useful and concrete. The cattle approached the trough, mooing softly in anticipation of their meal. "Easy, folks. There's enough for everyone," he said, unconsciously repeating the words he had heard Helen say minutes before. There was something comforting about this shared routine of caring for animals, even on separate properties. Helen reached the back fence and bent down to examine the wires. The sun was stronger now, and she felt a wave of heat that made her pause for a moment. Popcorn stayed by her side, watching intently as she fiddled with the wire strands. "Everything looks good here," she murmured, but as she stood up, a more intense wave of dizziness made her stumble slightly. Popcorn made a low sound, as if asking if she was okay. "Don't worry, my dear," she said, patting his head, "just a little tired." But it wasn't just fatigue. Helen had been diabetic for 15 years and knew the signs that something was wrong. Her mouth was dry, her vision slightly blurry, and the feeling of weakness she had tried to ignore was growing stronger. She decided to go back to the house and check her blood sugar. It was important not to let these things go unnoticed. Popcorn stayed by her side on the way back, but now his behavior was slightly different, closer, more attentive to her movements. Michael finished feeding the cattle and decided to check the water pump that supplied the troughs. It was routine maintenance, but essential to ensure the animals always had fresh water. As he worked, he occasionally heard the sounds from the neighboring property, the clucking of hens, the quacking of ducks, and sometimes Helen's soft voice talking to her animals. Helen reached the porch and sat for a moment in the chair where she used to have her afternoon coffee. Her breathing was more difficult now, and she knew she had to act quickly. Popcorn stood before her, clearly disturbed by the change in his caregiver's behavior. I need to check my glucose," she said, more to herself than to the goose. She tried to stand, but a wave of weakness made her hesitate. That's when it happened. A severe hypoglycemic episode overtook her body without warning. Helen tried to lean on the chair, but her knees gave out. She slid slowly to the porch floor, losing consciousness moments before her body hit the wooden planks. Popcorn stood motionless for a few seconds, as if trying to process what he had just witnessed. Then, something primitive and instinctive awoke in him, the same instinct that made his wild ancestors protect the flock. Helen was in danger, and he was the only one who could do something about it. The silence that followed was deafening. Popcorn cautiously approached Helen, nudging her arm with his beak, as he did when he wanted her attention. But this time, she didn't respond. She didn't open her eyes, didn't smile, didn't make that affectionate sound she always made when he sought her out. The young goose walked around the still body, making low, distressed sounds. His instincts told him something was terribly wrong, but he didn't understand exactly what it was. All he knew was that the most important person in his life needed help, and he was the only one there to provide it. Michael continued his routine on the neighboring farm. Completely unaware of the drama unfolding just a few yards away, the sound of the perfectly working water pump reassured him. Another task successfully completed. He checked his watch and figured he still had time to fix that creaky gate before lunch. Popcorn tried one more time to wake Helen, this time gently pulling the sleeve of her blouse with his beak. When that didn't work, he began to pace in circles, clearly agitated. It was as if all his instincts were screaming at him to do something, but his young mind couldn't process exactly what. It was then that an ancestral memory etched in the DNA of his past generations emerged. Geese are social animals that live in groups and protect one another. When a member of the flock is in danger, the others go for help. And Helen was his flock now. The goose looked at the fence separating the two properties. He had been on the other side a few times when he was even younger and could slip under the wire. He knew there was another human there, the one who sometimes waved to Helen and seemed friendly. Without hesitation, Popcorn ran towards the fence. The gap he used to pass through was smaller now that he had grown, but with determination and some effort, he managed to squeeze under the wire. A few feathers got caught on the metal, but he didn't even notice. He had a mission to accomplish. On the neighboring farm, Michael heard a strange noise coming from the direction of the fence. When he looked up, he saw Helen's goose running towards him, honking loudly in a way he had never heard before. The sound was urgent, desperate, completely different from the quiet noises the animal usually made. "Hey, what are you doing over here?" Michael said, pausing his work on the gate. "Shouldn't you be on the other side of the fence?" Popcorn didn't stop running until he was right in front of Michael. Once there, he began to honk even louder, pacing in circles around the young man, clearly trying to communicate something of extreme importance. Michael frowned, confused. The animal's behavior was completely abnormal. Geese were known to be territorial and usually avoided strangers, but this one was acting as if its life depended on getting his attention. "Easy, easy," Michael said, trying to calm the agitated animal. "Are you lost? You want me to take you back home?" But Popcorn didn't want to be calmed. He wanted action. He started running towards the fence, looking back as if expecting Michael to follow. When he realized the human wasn't moving, he ran back and started pulling at the cuff of Michael's jeans with his beak. "What the heck?" Michael muttered, completely bewildered by the goose's behavior. In all his years working with animals, he had never seen anything like it. The bird was clearly trying to tell him something, but what? It was then that Michael had to make a decision that would change everything. Michael gently tried to shoo the goose away, thinking perhaps it was just confused or scared from being away from its familiar territory, but Popcorn refused to be ignored. He came right back, this time even more insistent, pulling at Michael's clothes with more force and letting out cries that echoed across the quiet property. All right. I get that you want something," Michael said, finally giving the animal his full attention. "But I don't speak goose, buddy. You're going to have to give me a better clue." "Oh." Popcorn stopped pulling at his clothes and looked directly into Michael's eyes for a few seconds, as if assessing whether this human was smart enough to understand the urgency of the situation. Then, he made a decision. The goose ran a few yards towards the fence, stopped, and looked back to see if Michael was following. When he saw he wasn't, he ran back and repeated the process. Run, stop, look back. It was the classic behavior of an animal trying to lead someone to a specific place. Michael had seen dogs do this when they wanted to show him something important. But a goose? That was completely unheard of in his experience. Still, something about the urgency in the animal's behavior made him hesitate before simply sending it away. "You want me to go with you?" Michael asked, feeling slightly ridiculous for having a serious conversation with a goose, but the response was immediate. Popcorn bobbed his head and ran towards the fence again, this time honking at an even higher pitch. Michael's intuition, developed over years of working in the country and observing animals, began to whisper that something was wrong. Animals didn't act this way for no reason, and this goose was clearly desperate to show him something. Deciding to trust his instincts, Michael dropped his tools and started walking in the direction Popcorn was indicating. The goose immediately became calmer but kept up a quick pace, constantly looking back to make sure the human was still following. "I hope this isn't you wanting to show me where you hid your eggs," Michael muttered, trying to ease his own growing tension. But deep down, he knew the situation was more serious than that. When they reached the fence dividing the properties, Michael stopped. He had never set foot on Helen's land without permission, and even in a strange situation like this, his upbringing made him hesitate. Popcorn sensed the hesitation and became even more agitated. He slipped back under the fence and stood on the other side, continuing his desperate cries. It was as if he were saying, "Please, trust me, it's an emergency." Michael looked around, searching for any sign of Helen. Normally, by this time of the morning, he would have seen her at least once in the yard, tending to her animals or watering her plants. But today, the property seemed eerily quiet, except for the urgent cries of the goose. "Helen!" Michael called out, hoping she might hear him and explain what was going on with her goose. "Is everything okay over there?" No answer came. The silence was filled only by the increasingly desperate sounds from Popcorn, who was now running back and forth along the fence line, clearly frustrated at his inability to make Michael understand the urgency. It was then that Michael noticed something that made his blood run cold. The other birds on the property, the chickens, the ducks, were all huddled together in a specific area of the yard near the house, behaving anxiously. It was as if they also knew something was wrong, but only Popcorn had possessed the courage and intelligence to seek help. The combination of all these signs, the goose's desperate behavior, the unusual silence of the property, Helen's absence, and the agitation of the other animals, finally convinced Michael that he needed to investigate, regardless of social conventions. "All right, buddy," he said to Popcorn. "You win. Let's see what's going on." Michael carefully climbed the fence, feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. Popcorn immediately ran towards the house, constantly checking to see if the young man was still following. The goose seemed relieved to have finally convinced a human to help, but his agitation didn't subside. As they approached the house, Michael began to notice more disturbing details. The kitchen door was open, which was normal, but the bowl Helen used to feed the animals was overturned in the yard, with some corn feed scattered on the ground. It wasn't the kind of carelessness he would expect from such an organized woman. "Helen?" Michael called again, this time louder. "It's me, Michael, from next door. Is everything all right?" The silence he received in response made his heart race. Popcorn continued running towards the porch, and that's when Michael saw it. Helen was lying on the porch floor, motionless, with Popcorn positioned beside her like a vigilant guardian. The goose looked at Michael and made a lower sound as if to say, "This is it. This is why I needed your help." "Oh my God," Michael whispered, running the last few feet to the porch. His mind immediately switched to emergency mode, recalling the basic first aid training he had taken years ago. He knelt beside Helen and checked her breathing. She was alive, but clearly unconscious. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin was slightly pale and clammy. Michael wasn't a doctor, but he knew those signs pointed to a medical emergency. "Helen, can you hear me?" he said, gently touching her shoulder. There was no response. Popcorn came closer and nudged the woman's arm with his beak, as if trying to wake her for the 100th time. Michael pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911. As he waited for the call to connect, he watched Popcorn, who had positioned himself near Helen's head, as if protecting her. The animal's loyalty and intelligence deeply impressed him. "Hello, I need an ambulance right away," Michael said when the operator answered. He provided the address and quickly described the situation. "I found an elderly woman unconscious. She's breathing, but she's unresponsive." The operator asked several questions, The patient's approximate age, the circumstances in which she was found, any visible vital signs. Michael answered as best he could, explaining that she lived alone and that he had been alerted by, well, by her goose. By her goose? The operator repeated, clearly confused. It's a long story, Michael said. How long until the ambulance gets here? About 15 minutes, came the reply. Keep the patient warm and don't try to move her. Stay on the line if anything changes. Michael hung up and looked around, searching for something to cover Helen with. Popcorn watched him intently, as if assessing whether the human knew what he was doing. You did an amazing thing, Michael said to the goose as he went inside the house to find a blanket. If you hadn't come to get me... He didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew how the story could have ended. Helen could have lain there for hours, or even days, before anyone realized something was wrong. When Michael returned with a blanket, Popcorn had moved even closer to Helen, as if trying to warm her with his own body. It was a protective instinct Michael had never seen in a domestic animal before. He carefully covered Helen with the blanket and sat beside her to wait for the ambulance. Popcorn settled on the other side, creating a shared vigil. It was a surreal scene. A young farmer and a goose united by the same concern for a woman who clearly meant the world to both of them. How did you know what to do? Michael asked Popcorn, who looked at him with those intelligent eyes. How did you know I could help? Naturally, the goose didn't answer with words, but his calm, watchful presence said everything that needed to be said. The 15 minutes felt like an eternity. Michael constantly monitored Helen's breathing, while Popcorn remained at his post, occasionally nudging her hand with his beak as if to check if she was still there. During this agonizing wait, Michael had time to reflect on what had just happened. He had always known that animals were smart, but he had never imagined a goose could display such a capacity for reasoning and loyalty. Popcorn had not only identified an emergency, but had formulated and executed a plan to get help. You knew I could climb the fence, Michael murmured to the goose. You knew I had a phone, that I could call for help. How did you know that? Popcorn raised his head and looked at him for a moment, as if pondering the question. Then he turned his attention back to Helen, never fully relaxing his guard. The sound of a distant siren brought immediate relief. Michael stood up and waved towards the road, guiding the ambulance to the correct entrance. Popcorn also seemed to understand that help was arriving. His feathers settled a bit, and his posture became less tense. The paramedic team arrived quickly, 2 experienced professionals who immediately took control of the situation. Michael briefly explained how he had found Helen, omitting only the most unbelievable part about being alerted by a goose. She's diabetic, one of the paramedics said after checking a medical alert bracelet on Helen's wrist. Probably a severe hypoglycemic episode. Good job finding her so quickly. Michael nodded, watching as they checked her vitals and prepared to administer intravenous glucose. Popcorn had to be gently moved aside to give the paramedics room to work, but he didn't go far, just enough to stay out of the way, always keeping Helen in his line of sight. How long do you think she was unconscious? One of the paramedics asked. I'm not sure, Michael replied, but probably not long. I was alerted pretty quickly. As the paramedics administered the treatment, Michael noticed that Popcorn was watching their every move with intense concentration. It was as if the goose was trying to understand if these strangers were truly helping his favorite person, or if they posed a threat. Gradually, Helen began to show signs of improvement. Her eyelids fluttered, and she made a low sound. Popcorn immediately perked up, craning his neck towards her. Helen, can you hear me? One of the paramedics said. You had a drop in your blood sugar? But you're being treated. Everything's going to be okay. Helen opened her eyes slowly, confused and disoriented. Her gaze wandered over the strangers' faces until it landed on Michael, whom she vaguely recognized as her neighbor, and then on Popcorn. "Popcorn!" she whispered, her voice weak. The goose immediately came closer, gently touching her hand with his beak. Tears welled up in her eyes as the memory of what had happened began to return. He went to get help, didn't he?" she asked, looking at Michael with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. Michael nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "He came running over to my property, honking like the world was ending. He didn't stop until I followed him back here." Helen tried to lift her hand to touch Popcorn, but was still too weak. The paramedic instructed her to lie still while they prepared to transport her to the hospital for observation. "We're going to take you in for some tests," the paramedic explained to Michael. "She'll probably be under observation for a few hours, but she should make a full recovery." As they prepared the stretcher, Helen looked worriedly at Popcorn and the other animals. "Who's going to take care of them?" she asked faintly. "Don't you worry about that now," Michael said without hesitation. "I'll take care of everything until you get back." It was a promise he never thought he'd make, but it came from his lips naturally. After the ambulance left with Helen, a strange silence settled over the property. Michael stood on the porch for a few minutes, still processing everything that had happened. Popcorn remained where Helen had been lying, staring down the road where the ambulance had disappeared. "She's going to be okay," Michael said to the goose, not sure if the animal could understand his words, but feeling the need to offer some comfort. "The doctors will take care of her." Popcorn looked at him with those expressive eyes, and Michael had the strange feeling that the goose understood far more than any animal should be able to. The other birds on the property, the chickens and ducks, began to approach cautiously, as if sensing the danger had passed, but still unsettled by Helen's absence. Michael watched as Popcorn positioned himself between them and the area where Helen had been, naturally assuming a role of leadership and protection. "Well," Michael said, looking around the property, "let's see what you all need." It was noon, and the birds probably needed fresh water and maybe more food. Michael had never cared for chickens, ducks, and geese before, but he knew the basics about animals, and he had promised Helen he would take care of everything. Popcorn followed him as he explored the property, checking the feeders and waterers. The goose seemed to be taking on the role of a guide, showing him where things were located. When Michael hesitated about where to find the feed, Popcorn walked directly to a small shed where bags of corn were stored. "You really understand what's happening, don't you?" Michael said, impressed. "It's not just instinct. You're thinking, planning." As he filled the feeders, Michael thought about his conversation with the paramedics. They had praised his quickness in finding Helen, saying he had likely saved her life. But the truth was, all the credit belonged to Popcorn. The goose had demonstrated a level of intelligence and compassion that challenged everything Michael thought he knew about animals. The phone in his pocket rang. It was the hospital. "Hello, is this Michael, the neighbor who found Mrs. Helen?" "This is he," Michael answered, his heart quickening. "She's stable and conscious. She'd like to speak with you for a moment." There was a pause, and then Helen's weak but determined voice came through the line. "Michael, how's Popcorn and the other animals?" Michael smiled, looking at the goose who had positioned himself nearby, as if trying to listen to the conversation. "They're fine," he replied. "Popcorn is right here by my side, supervising everything. I don't think he completely trusts me yet." Helen gave a weak laugh. "He's very protective. He's always been special since the day he was born. I knew he was different from the others, but I never imagined that he could do what he did today," Michael finished. "Helen, I have to admit something. When he came over to my property, at first I thought he was just a lost goose causing trouble. I almost sent him away." "But you didn't," she said. "You paid attention. You trusted him. That says a lot about your character, too." Michael felt a warmth in his chest. "When will you be able to come home?" The doctors want to keep me for observation until tomorrow morning, just to be safe. You really don't mind taking care of them until then? Michael looked at Popcorn, who was watching him intently, and at the other birds who had calmed down under his care. I don't mind one bit, he said. In fact, I think it's an honor. And he truly meant it. Being there, caring for the animals that meant so much to Helen, and especially working alongside Popcorn, was changing something fundamental in his outlook on life. After hanging up, Michael decided he would spend the rest of the day learning the animal's routine. Popcorn became his unofficial guide, showing him where everything was and the right time for each activity. It was surprising to discover how structured life was on the small farm. Helen had created a meticulous routine that met the specific needs of each animal. The chickens had set times to return to the coop. The ducks needed their pond cleaned daily, and Popcorn apparently had free rein of the entire property and acted as a sort of general supervisor. During the afternoon, Michael had time to observe the interactions among the animals. It was fascinating to see how Popcorn related differently to each group. With the chickens, he was protective but respectful of their space. With the ducks, playful and social. But it was with Helen that Michael realized he had the deepest connection. "You miss her, don't you?" Michael asked as he watched Popcorn repeatedly look towards the road. The goose returned to the spot on the porch where Helen had fallen, as if expecting her to reappear. As the day wore on, Michael began to understand why Helen was so attached to her animals. There was a subtle but real communication between her and them, a language of mutual care that he was only just beginning to perceive. And Popcorn was clearly at the center of that communication. Late in the afternoon, Michael called the hospital again to check on Helen. The nurse said she was doing well, but was anxious about her animals. Michael asked to speak with her. "How was your first day as a caregiver?" Helen asked, and Michael could hear the smile in her voice. "Educational," he answered honestly. "Popcorn is a very patient teacher. He showed me where everything is, when to feed each group, even how to lock up the coop at the right time." "He's always been like that," Helen said fondly. "Even as a little one, he seemed to understand he needed to help. When my husband was sick, Popcorn would stay with him in the yard, as if he knew he needed company." Michael felt a pang in his heart, imagining the scene. "Helen, can I ask you something? Have you ever seen him do anything like this before? Get help like that?" There was a pause. "Not exactly like this," she said finally. "But he's always been special. One time, when I fell in the yard and sprained my ankle, he stayed with me until I could get up. Another time, when one of the ducks was sick, he came and got me and led me to where the duck was hiding. But what he did today was extraordinary," Michael completed. "It was a miracle," she corrected gently. "I could have been there for days. My closest neighbors besides you live miles away. If Popcorn hadn't gone for help." They both fell silent for a moment, contemplating the gravity of the situation and the magnitude of what the goose had done. "Michael," Helen said finally, "when I get home tomorrow, I'd like you to come over for dinner. I want to make something special for you, and for Popcorn too, of course." Michael smiled. "I'd be honored. But let me cook for you. After what you've been through today, you should rest." "It's a deal then," she said, "but I insist on making the cornbread. It's Popcorn's favorite." After hanging up, Michael looked at the goose, who had moved closer during the conversation, as if trying to hear the news about Helen. "She's coming home tomorrow," Michael told him, "and she's going to make your favorite cornbread." Popcorn tilted his head, and Michael got the impression that the animal understood perfectly. More than that, for the first time since that morning, Popcorn seemed to relax completely, as if he finally believed his special person was truly safe and coming home. That night, Michael decided to sleep on Helen's porch just to make sure everything was okay. And Popcorn, true to his role as guardian, stayed awake for most of the night, watching over the property and his new human friend. The next morning brought a different energy to the property. Michael woke up early on the porch to find Popcorn already up, looking expectantly down the road. It was as if the Goose knew this would be the day of Helen's return. "She said she'd be here around 10, Michael said, checking the time on his phone. "Still a little while." Even so, Popcorn began his morning routine with more excitement than the day before. He checked all the feeders, made his rounds of the other animals, and then returned to his vigil, watching the road. Michael used the time to tidy up the house and yard. He wanted everything to be perfect for Helen's arrival. As he worked, he reflected on how the past 2 days had changed his perspective on so many things. He had always been a practical person, focused on tangible results and logical solutions, but the experience with Popcorn had forced him to consider aspects of animal intelligence and emotion he had never taken seriously before. How could you scientifically explain what the Goose had done? How could you categorize the loyalty, the strategic reasoning, the communication skills the animal had demonstrated? At 9:45 a.m., Popcorn began to get visibly agitated. He paced back and forth near the gate, making low sounds of anticipation. Michael looked at the empty road and frowned. "How do you know she's coming?" he asked. But 5 minutes later, the sound of an approaching car answered his question. Popcorn erupted in a celebration of honks and flapping wings as the taxi pulled into the driveway. Before Helen could even get out of the car completely, the Goose was by her side, nudging her hand with his beak and circling around her in a dance of pure joy. "Hi, my love," Helen said, stroking Popcorn's head with tears in her eyes. "I missed you so much too." Michael approached to help her with her small bag, but paused for a moment to watch the reunion. The connection between the woman and the Goose was deep and genuine, a language of love that transcended species. "How are you feeling?" Michael asked when he finally got her attention. "Much better," Helen replied, though Michael noticed she still seemed a bit frail. "The doctors said it was severe hypoglycemia. If you hadn't found me when you did." "If Popcorn hadn't come to get me," Michael corrected, "the credit is all his." Helen looked at the Goose, who had positioned himself close to her like a bodyguard. "You saved my life," she said to him, "my brave hero." The three of them spent the rest of the morning talking on the porch, with Helen recounting her hospital experience and Michael reporting on how things had gone with the animals. Popcorn remained close to Helen the entire time, occasionally touching her hand as if to make sure she was really there. "Michael," Helen said eventually, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. Taking care of my animals, staying here all night." "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "Actually, I should be thanking you. This experience has taught me a lot about a lot of things I'd never considered before." Helen smiled. "Popcorn has that effect on people. He forces us to see the world differently." That afternoon, as promised, Michael prepared a special lunch while Helen insisted on baking cornbread for Popcorn. When she placed a piece on the floor for the Goose, he ate it with obvious pleasure, but not before looking at her as if to say, "Thank you for being home." "You know," Michael said as they washed dishes together, "I think from now on, I'm going to pay more attention to animals. All of them, not just the ones I look after on my farm." "They have so much to teach us," Helen agreed, "especially about loyalty, unconditional love, and being present in the moments that truly matter." Popcorn, who had finished his cornbread, approached the two of them in the kitchen, as if wanting to be part of the conversation. Michael knelt down and stroked his head. "Thank you, buddy," he said sincerely, "for teaching me that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the most unexpected places." In the weeks that followed, life in the rural area found a new rhythm. Michael began visiting Helen regularly, not just to check if she was okay, but because he genuinely enjoyed her company and that of the animals. And Popcorn, naturally, became the bridge between their two worlds. The story of the rescue spread through the small rural community, turning Popcorn into a local celebrity of sorts. Neighbors came from miles around to meet the goose that saved a life. But Helen always made sure to explain that it wasn't just about the rescue, it was about recognizing the intelligence and capacity for love in the animals that share our lives. Michael installed a gate between the two properties, making it easier to pass between them. Helen joked that Popcorn now had two homes, and the goose took advantage of his new freedom to supervise both farms, maintaining his self-appointed role as the region's guardian. A veterinarian from town, intrigued by the story, came to examine Popcorn and confirm his health. He was impressed not only by the animal's physical condition, but by clear signs of above-average intelligence. "Geese are naturally intelligent," he explained to Helen and Michael, "but this one demonstrates exceptional cognitive abilities. The way he processed the emergency, formulated a plan of action, and successfully executed it indicates a level of reasoning we rarely see." Helen stroked Popcorn with pride. "I always knew he was special, from the very first day." The experience also transformed Michael in ways he hadn't expected. He began to study more about animal behavior, fascinated by discoveries about emotional and social intelligence in different species. His own farm became more harmonious as he started treating his animals not just as productive resources, but as individuals with their own personalities. "You know what impresses me the most?" Michael said to Helen during one of their dinners, which had become a weekly tradition. "It's that Popcorn wasn't trained to do what he did. There was no instruction manual, he just knew." "Love teaches," Helen replied simply. "When you truly love someone, you find ways to protect them, no matter the obstacles." Popcorn, as if understanding he was being praised, approached the table where they were sitting. Helen held out her hand, and he rested his head on it, closing his eyes in contentment. Months later, when a journalist from the city came to interview Helen about the story, she made sure the focus wasn't just on the dramatic rescue, but on the larger message behind it. "Sometimes we think we're the ones taking care of the animals," she told the journalist, with Popcorn by her side. "But the truth is, they take care of us too. They teach us about compassion, loyalty, and being present for those we love. Popcorn saved me physically that day, but he has been saving me emotionally every day since he came into my life." Michael, who was present for the interview, added, "This experience taught me that intelligence and love aren't exclusive to humans. All living beings have capabilities we may not fully understand, but that we must respect and value." Popcorn's story became a symbol in the region of how deep and transformative the connection between humans and animals can be. Local schools began inviting Helen to speak about empathy and animal care, always with Popcorn by her side as a living example that every being deserves love and respect. And so, what began as an ordinary morning on a farm transformed into a lasting lesson about courage, love, and the extraordinary capacity all living things have to care for one another. Popcorn continues to be Helen's vigilant guardian, but now he is also an ambassador for the message that sometimes the greatest heroes come in the most unexpected packages. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment telling us about a special moment you've shared with an animal. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that celebrate the unique connection between humans and animals. Until next time.